afternoon. Thank you for joining us for Lunch and Learn. I am Cheyenne. I'm the Public Programming Coordinator here at the History Center, and I would just like to welcome everyone joining us here in person and also everyone joining us in the live webinar. I will make sure to leave some time at the end for questions. And for those of us joining online, feel free to leave questions and comments in the chat, and Katie will relay those to me. So, like I said, I'm Cheyenne. Usually I am behind the scenes of our Lunch and Learns. This is my first one that I am delivering, so I am a little bit nervous, but I appreciate you all bearing with me, and it's good to see some familiar faces. So I am going to be presenting today on Greenwood, and I originally started doing research on Greenwood earlier this year for an article that is coming out in the community paper, and I found so much interest in Greenwood that I was not able to fit everything into the article, and so I was like, okay, I need to put together a PowerPoint and force a bunch of people to listen to the history, because it's really interesting. So without further ado, let's get started. So on the southeast side of downtown Orlando, there is a big, beautiful old cemetery that has a story to tell. The cemetery was created by some of Orlando's early founders, and it's also the resting place of a few of the original founders of the cemetery and the citizens who played a major role in the growth of our city. So what did Orlando originally look like? Well, in the 1860s, the area that we now know as Orlando did not resemble the city that we know today. The first community building was a general store that also served as a post office, and settlers purchased vast tracts of land for homesteading. So that included growing crops, cattle farming, living, and ultimately a space to lay their dead to rest. And this is a photo that I pulled from our archives here at the History Center of a typical trading post of the 1850s. I think a good modern day example of what was happening in Orlando at that time is actually Lou Gardens. So if you've ever visited Lou Gardens, you know that they have the historic home. And if you've ever wandered around the property, I'm sure that you have stumbled upon the cemetery that they have at the Lou Gardens with some of the original settlers buried there. So I think Lou Gardens is a great example of just how much land people were purchasing and for what reasons, to build their families and to have room to grow food and to also have space to lay their dead to rest. There was not a central cemetery at that time. On August 3rd of 1875, the city of Orlando was incorporated, and it required the vote of all 25 people living in the 2 square miles that would become downtown Orlando, which is wild to me to think that there was only 25 people down here at one point. At this time, there was no apparent need for a large burial site, and most people were buried on their own land. However, as Mosquito County grew, some complained that private plots sat on viable real estate. Samuel Robinson, in his letter to the Reporter-Star on September 14th, 1915, writes about the burial situation at that time. So he said, and I'm not going to do a Samuel Robinson impression, but he said that the importance of a large burial ground was not contemplated, and interments were made in many places in the vicinity. Some were taken to Conway, some also to Powell, south of Orlando, and some to the Beasley plot 6 miles west of Orlando. Many were buried at their home grounds, as was David Mizell. In the north part of Orlando, overlooking Highland Lake, many burials were made, but there is now nothing left there to show a single grave. Many were buried north of a building which stood on the north side of Church Street and the east part of the Tremont Hotel Yard. So the first cemetery that Mr. Robinson talks about is the Powell Cemetery south of Orlando. I'm sure many of us have driven by this on Orange Avenue and never paid a second glance, but it is still in existence today, and it's located near Lake Jenny Jewel on the west side of Orange Avenue at 3858 South Orange Ave. The second cemetery was used by the Beasley, Ivy, Patrick, and Robertson families. This cemetery was located between Lake Lorna Dune and Rock Lake. This cemetery was going to be developed, so on March 18th, 1984, the four families formed the Lake Hill Cemetery Association, and they moved their family members to Orla Vista on Old Winter Garden Road. And the third cemetery Mr. Robinson mentions is important because it would later share history with Greenwood. The cemetery, located between Church Street and Pine Street, was on the east side of Main Street. And Main Street is now Magnolia Avenue, so for those unfamiliar, it's the road that runs right next to the History Center. And this lot was originally part of the old Tremont Hotel yard. In 1872, the building on the north side of Church Street was the first free school building and later became a church. This was how the street became known as Church Street. This lot was the free school yard and later became a church cemetery. The Baptist Church wanted to develop the lot, and in 1894 had all of the graves moved to Greenwood. By 1880, the land boom had created a need for a community burial site. Previously, in August of 1879, the street committee had been given approval by the city to look into acquiring a suitable place for a community cemetery. In that same year, Mr. Malin Gore, who was the dean of the newspaper and later became the mayor of Orlando, led a strong fight through his newspaper to alert people to the importance of a community burial site. So in 1880, a group of 8 men joined together and formed a stock company titled the Orlando Cemetery Company. These men purchased land from Mr. John W. Anderson. It was a 26-acre parcel of land for the sum of $1,800. This parcel on the southeast side of town was where the original cemetery was laid out. So this is a map of the original cemetery. So you see right there, there's Gore Street on the bottom. And yes, this diamond shape was the original cemetery. And the 8 residents who made up the Orlando Cemetery Company were probably very familiar names to you if you've lived here in Orlando for any amount of time. It was L.P. Westcott, C.A. Boone, James K. Duke, J.H. Livingston, Nat Points, W.R. Anno, James Delaney, and Samuel Robinson, and L.P. Westcott received the deed. And the cemetery was designed and surveyed and platted by Mr. Samuel Robinson and Otto Fries. So through my research, I was very curious as to who Samuel Robinson was. He comes up a lot when you're researching about Greenwood, about Orlando. There's streets named after him. So I did a little bit of digging. Mr. Robinson, he attended the country school in Michigan until the age of 13, at which time he moved in with a minister, and while working on the farm, he received private instruction and later taught school in Indiana. And then he moved back to Michigan, married, and he moved to Orlando in 1876, 1 year after Orlando was incorporated. Mr. Robinson, he came to Orlando for the purpose of laying out an orange grove for his brother Norman, who would later play an instrumental role in the growth of Orlando and Rollins College, where he would become a professor. And Mr. Robinson's first home was a log cabin that, if you're familiar with where Carl Dan's house, it's another historic home, was, that's where his original home was, and it was filled with plaster in the gaps of logs, and it was the only home in the area that was constructed this way and piqued a lot of interest. This is another house by Samuel Robinson that is still in existence today. So if you go to 419 North Magnolia Avenue today while you're leaving, you can see what old Orlando homes might have looked like at that time. And he was also a county surveyor for 16 years, and he laid out many of the existing roadways in surrounding towns. He was state and county assessor for 5 years and a member of the state legislature for 2 terms. He died in Orlando on February 21st, 1926, and he is buried at Greenwood. So if you have any problems with how the roadways are laid out, maybe go pay him a visit at the cemetery and let him know your thoughts. So he, in a humble quote by Mr. Robinson in his letter to the Reporter-Star, states that the cemetery's design was pronounced by experts to be one of the best original designs. And he goes on to say that the city of Lakeland, Florida, copied him in 1914 when building their cemetery. The original entrance was on the south side of the cemetery at Gore Street, and the entrance is still there, but it is no longer in use. So I would like to show you how Greenwood has developed over the years. So I have a diagram here of the expansion. Starting in 1880, we have the diamond shape. That was the Orlando Cemetery Company. And then as time went on, it grew, acquired more land, and we end with what we have today. As a disclaimer, you might hear me say land purchase dates that don't exactly align with the date shown here, and that is just because it takes time between purchasing of land and when it's actually added on to the property. So, as we discussed earlier, Greenwood was created in 1880 under the name Orlando Cemetery Company. Well, the cemetery was turned over to the undertaker E.A. Richards and unfortunately was forgotten about. It did not take long for the property to become overgrown with weeds and brush. I'm sure that if you didn't mow your lawn for 2 weeks, you know what probably happened at Greenwood during that time. And unfortunately, a fire swept through and it destroyed the cemetery. This caused an uproar in the community, especially since some of the people could only afford wooden headstones, which were burned up in the fire. The fire hit Section A and H the hardest, and these are the 2 wooden headstones that are still around. So in 1893, the committee awarded Elijah Hand a contract to bury paupers for $5 per interment. And if you're like me and you had never heard of the term paupers before, that is just someone who maybe didn't have a home, or they didn't have a name, or people didn't know their name. They had a name, but people didn't know their name, or they just did not have enough money to afford a service or a tombstone. So they had a contract to bury them for $5, and they also authorized Otto Fries to plat the cemetery and set aside a 50 square foot area in Section J for Orange County Confederate soldiers. Then in 1894, the Downtown Baptist Church wanted to begin the development of the property on the corner of Pine Street and Main Street, which is now Magnolia Avenue. This property, as was mentioned earlier, was the site of the first downtown cemetery. The church then had all of the known graves relocated to the Orlando Cemetery site where they were reinterred. Most of the graves were marked or were identified by family members. However, not all of the graves were successfully found. In 1896, the city began improvement projects at the cemetery and planted large clumps of bamboo at the 4 corners of the cemetery, and they also hired Mr. W.H. Knoll as the first sexton at a salary of $60 per year plus burial charges. The city also took over all records of the cemetery from its original owners and issued deeds to all people entitled. In 1899, the cemetery established a section for paupers in Section H, and this is a photo of the pauper grave sites. However, this is in Section Q, next to where the people from Sunland are buried. This practice would later be stopped, and a pauper cemetery would be established on what is now Michigan Avenue. This cemetery would become known as Orange Hill Cemetery. So if you've ever driven down Michigan Avenue in the south downtown Conway area, you might have seen Orange Hill Cemetery. It looks like a really big empty field, but there are 552 people buried here. And so Orange Hill was a pauper cemetery that was in operation between 1907 to 1961. And if you're familiar with Johnny's Fill-In Station, it's right across the street from Johnny's. And then later that same year, the Daughters of the American Revolution had the bodies of their veterans removed from their current burial site and interred at their new location set aside for them at the Orlando Cemetery in Section I. On October 25th, 1907, the city purchased additional property from Samuel Robinson on the north and west side of the cemetery. Now, if you have visited Greenwood at all, as I'm sure many of you have probably heard of this story before, and I think it is a very fun story. So let me set the scene. The story takes place in 1910 and is the story of an Englishman named Fred Weeks. He was staying at a local hotel in downtown. One afternoon, Mr. Weeks was riding through the country with a boy whose family owned the hotel, and while riding, they came across 3 men who were burning and clearing a piece of land. They saw the 20-acre tract, and the men began to tell Weeks how great a piece of land it was. And Mr. Weeks was unable to see the back part of the land because the smoke from the fires was so thick. So, Mr. Weeks, trusting the men, bought the land. The next day, he drove his friends out to see the piece of land, and now that the smoke had cleared, he could see that the land he bought was mostly swamp. So Mr. Weeks turned his wagon around and he went home. A few days later, Mr. Weeks bought a cemetery plot at the entrance of the cemetery and erected a tombstone with the inscription, "There was a man came down from Jericho and fell among thieves." So this is not the original tombstone that he purchased, because the quote was followed by the names of the 3 men that he thought had swindled him. And this caused such an uproar in the town that the 3 men were forced to give Weeks his money back and buy his cemetery plot to take down the tombstone. Mr. Weeks, however, carried on his vendetta by building an impressive mausoleum, the one that you see, with the same quotation, "There was a man came down from Jericho and fell among thieves." The names of the men, however, were later removed. Some say that the men paid to have them chiseled off in the dark of the night, and others say that it was under the threat of lawsuits. Mr. Weeks died in 1918, and he was laid to rest in his mausoleum. Mrs. Weeks was so angered by her husband's insistence on carrying out this vendetta that she refused to be buried there. When she died, her remains were taken to her former home in Indiana, and the mausoleum still stands today. And then in 1911, an act of legislature expanded the boundaries of the city by adding a section on all 4 sides of the current city, and this expansion also included the 40-acre tract known as the Orlando Cemetery. And I found that fact quite interesting just because through my research, I found that a lot of bigger cities, they had a rule where a cemetery had to lie 3 miles outside of the city. And so I found it very interesting that here in Orlando, the city included Greenwood. And then in June 8th of 1915, the city received a letter from 2 of the remaining founders, C.A. Boone and Samuel A. Robinson. They requested that the name of the cemetery be changed from the Orlando Cemetery to Greenwood Cemetery. Just prior to this letter, a request was printed in the newspaper to have names sit into the council for consideration. A meeting was held later, and the name Greenwood was adopted by the council. In 1919, the entrance on the south side of the cemetery was permanently closed, and the new entrance established on the east side. And then on January 27th, 1927, the city purchased the property adjacent to the cemetery known as the Sinkhole for the sum of $25,000. The city has since turned this into the Greenwood Urban Wetland Park, and then later that same year, on June 8th, 1927, the city voted to ask the county commissioner's office for a paved road to the entrance of the cemetery. Then, in June of 1935, the 30-acre parcel that was on the north side of Greenwood was traded to expand the cemetery. This parcel of land was part of the original Jonestown community, and a northerner named Ches Magruder owned this parcel of land. So if you look here where Jonestown is, below Jonestown, that's where the cemetery was lying, and then that circle within a circle within a circle, that was where the sinkhole was. And if you know the Fern Creek area at all, you know that there are also a lot of other bodies of water in that area. So if you've never heard of Jonestown in Orlando before, Jonestown was founded by former enslaved people, and it actually became the first African-American community around 1880. So Sam Jones and his wife Penny, they settled along the banks of Fern Creek, and Orlando's promise of growth and prosperity attracted other African Americans hoping to find new lives in Florida. Some people worked on building the South Florida Railroad, while others served in the homes and business establishments of the white residents. Unfortunately, African American communities were notoriously pushed to the least desirable areas on the outskirts of cities. Jonestown occupied a low area near the Greenwood Cemetery. And during the rainy season of 1904, the sinkhole at the cemetery overflowed, and with nearby Lake Davis, Lancaster, Cherokee, and Lucerne, flooded Jonestown to the rafters of the one-story houses. Drainage wells eventually solved the flooding problem, but people who escaped the flooding had by then found other places and did not return. In 1907, the Orlando City Directory makes no mention of Jonestown, although it had been there for 27 years. And then by 1916, the community had reappeared. However, it was different. Fewer people owned their homes, and Magruder, a northerner who owned land, owned and rented about 12 houses in the area. Then in 1935, Magruder made a deal with the city. He owned the 30 acres and traded his land to the city to forgive $21,600 in taxes that he owed. Most of Jonestown was sold off, and the area experienced rapid change. The city was expanding, and the residents no longer wanted Jonestown close by. The area that was not part of the cemetery became lower-income housing for white residents, and the remaining residents of Jonestown were pushed to other housing communities for African-American residents. So the purchase of 1935 was obviously a really big controversy, but one of the biggest supporters of this purchase was a Mr. W.R. O'Neill. And Mr. O'Neill addressed the mayor and council members by telling them of the fire which swept through Greenwood when it was a private cemetery. He said that the shrubbery was ruined and many graves have never been identified. He went on to talk about how he and the late George Newell had been active in trying to get the city to take over the cemetery operations before the city's decision to buy Greenwood in 1892. And he also spoke of how his wife was instrumental in the beautification of the cemetery, and he praised it as being one of the finest anywhere. And then in another newspaper article dated June 27, 1935, the city agreed to purchase the Magruder land for the sum of $21,600. An agreement was reached so that the money received would go to pay back property taxes owed to the city, state, and county by the Magruder estate. The city felt that this was a very fair price and a wise move since, as Mayor Estes pointed out, Mr. Magruder had asked for over $100,000 for that same parcel 2 years earlier, and that the present Greenwood Cemetery was almost full. The mayor also calculated that it would take an investment of about $40,000 to create a cemetery that could produce gross revenues of over $200,000. In the 1940s, the cemetery expanded to 100 acres, and Section K, which was reserved for African American residents, was opened. In Section K, there is a headstone dedicated for July Perry. You might have heard this name before. July Perry was born in 1868, lived in Ocoee, Florida. He was a civil rights leader in the community, and he worked to ensure that Black residents were registered and able to vote. On November 2, 1920, Black residents were turned away from voting. That night, while protecting members of his community from threats of violence, a mob showed up to his house and began shooting. Unfortunately, that night, July Perry was lynched by the mob. On November 2, 2002, his descendants and the West Orange Reconciliation Task Force dedicated a gravestone for July Perry, commemorating the 82nd anniversary of the Election Day riot in Ocoee. It is said that today, visitors or voters will visit and leave flowers for July Perry at his gravesite to thank him for his fight for voter rights. So during Jim Crow laws, Black and white people could not be buried together. So at the cemetery, there is Section K, T, and 3 that are dedicated to the Black population of Orlando. However, what made Greenwood unique is that in most cemeteries, the segregated grave sites wouldn't even be in the same fence line as the white grave plots. At Greenwood, all of the grave sites were within the same fence line, and the ironic thing is that when Greenwood was platted, they wanted the African-American grave sites to be in the back of the graveyard. So Section K, if you've ever been to Greenwood, it's right next to the home that is on, or the offices that are on the Greenwood property. So the original entrance was off of Gore Street, but once they added the new entrance, it actually put Section K right in the front and center of the cemetery. So fast forward to a rapidly growing city, history began to resurface. On January 27, 1950, Construction workers excavating for an addition to the downtown Baptist church unearthed the remnants of an old metal casket. The local health officer thought it may have been a soldier killed in the Seminole War. However, others thought that the casket was much more elaborate than those provided by the government at that time. Only an iron top, cast lead handles, and a plate glass inner sealer remained. The body was reinterred at Greenwood. On November 13, 1986, while digging an elevator shaft for the downtown Baptist church, 4 construction workers unearthed a metal casket. At first, people thought that they dug up the same old casket that had been found 36 years prior. However, the description of the casket did not match. This casket was in much better condition, and it was all metal, about 6 feet long, wide at the shoulders, and tapered at the feet. There was an oval metal plate and over a glass window that covered the face, and the metal plate had rusted in half and the glass had been broken. This revealed the skull and forearm folded over the chest. There were several unmarked graves at the cemetery, which was moved in 1894 to Greenwood. This was obviously another one of the graves that had been missed. After consulting the Orlando Police Department, Orange County Medical Examiner, and the Orange Osceola State Attorney, the church decided to bury the casket where they found it. 4 days after the casket was unearthed, they performed a brief ceremony and laid the casket to rest at the base of the elevator shaft. The crew laid a piece of sheet metal over the exposed hole on the casket and covered it with 5 feet of dirt and 1 foot of concrete. Around 1952, state-of-the-art tuberculosis hospitals opened. However, when a vaccine for tuberculosis was discovered, there was no longer a need for these hospitals. Most were closed by the 1960s. In 1961, the Florida Department of Health opened the hospital under the name Sunland Training Centers. The main building was located in Orlando, however, it was a new building. The other Sunland centers were housed in the former tuberculosis hospitals. Sunland was a residential facility that cared for profoundly mentally and physically disabled adults and children. The facility was unfortunately understaffed and had a lack of funds. An investigation was conducted in the 1970s after reports of abuse and neglect, ranging from getting bitten by rodents and pests to physical beatings. This was only a glimpse into the neglect that went on in these facilities. Sunland was finally closed in 1983 after a series of lawsuits and investigations. And now you can find the grave sites in Section Q at Greenwood. Younger patients were buried in sections of Greenwood called Babyland, and there are 3 Babylands that are reserved for children under 5 years old. Many passed on the same day they were born, and you will see graves that have no name and 1 date. In September of 1959, a 2-bedroom and 1-bath house was erected for the caretaker, and that has since been converted into the present-day offices. And in an article from the Sentinel dated February 28, 1967, the city repealed an ordinance requiring segregation in the burial areas at Greenwood. Another Sentinel article dated January 29, 1970, speaks of how quickly the cemetery was running out of space and that it would be full in a couple of years. The article from the Sentinel, dated November 7, 1983, talks of the proposal of double vaults as a solution to the limited amount of space. This plan was later accepted and was only in use for Section 12, but it was challenging and an impractical design, so it was not further used. Then in 2016, Greenwood expanded slightly. The northern part of the cemetery expanded towards Anderson. Then, later into the year, the tragedy at the Pulse nightclub happened, where 49 lives were taken. Although not originally intended for the gravesites of a mass shooting, Greenwood offered gravesites to the victims. Not all of the victims are buried at the cemetery, but this expansion now honors the 49 victims, which was, at the time, the largest mass shooting in U.S. history. The gravesites are to allow family and friends a place to visit their loved ones in Orlando. Local Central Florida florists donated flowers to the sites, and families were able to receive a limo ride to their loved one's service. So, as you can tell, Greenwood is more than just a cemetery. It's a historical site that tells the story of Orlando. In recent years, the Confederate statue that lived at Lake Eola for 106 years was moved to Greenwood in 2017. However, this wasn't the first time that the statue was moved. In 1917, the statue, which originally sat on Main Street, which is now Magnolia, was moved to Lake Eola. This statue, called Johnny Reb, represents the common Confederate soldier. In 2017, the 9-ton statue was removed piece by piece and was sent off to be refurbished. Over the course of its very long life, it sustained damage that needed to be addressed, and then the statue was rehomed to the Confederate section of Greenwood, which also features an educational placard. Interestingly, while removing the statue, workers found a small time capsule weighing around 3 pounds. Inside of the time capsule, they found a trove of relics, including Confederate money, old newspaper, miniature Confederate flags, and various documents associated with the United Daughters of the Confederacy, including minutes from a statewide annual conference in 1910. Its relocation to Greenwood made the most sense because the Daughters of the Confederacy already owned the land where the Confederate graves rested. And finally, you might have heard of the annual event Wreaths Across America. So this organization has its beginnings in 1992, and it honors fallen soldiers every year in December. When Morrill Worcester, owner of Worcester Wreath Company, was 12, he won a trip to Washington, D.C., and seeing the hundreds of thousands of graves and the tomb of the unknown soldier made an impression on him. In 1992, his company found themselves with a surplus of wreaths nearing the end of the holiday season. Remembering his experience from when he was a boy, he made arrangements for the surplus wreaths to be placed at Arlington in one of the older cemetery sections that didn't receive many visitors. Throughout the years, more organizations pitched in to help, and eventually it grew to be a nationwide event. This year, Wreaths Across America will be at Greenwood on December 16th at noon, and the organization provides a ceremony and asks for help sponsoring wreaths and with placing wreaths on the graves. Their goal is to place a wreath on 2,500 veteran graves. So nowadays, Greenwood is pretty quiet. They are fully sold out of grave sites. However, they are not fully interred. So if you're interested in a permanent resting ground at Greenwood, I would be on the lookout to marry into a family with plots waiting for spouses. And today, Greenwood is focused on digitizing all of their records, gathering more items from the community for their collection, preserving material, adding acknowledgments for Sunland, Jonestown, the segregated plots, and the paupers, and maintain the grounds through providing safe homes for the wildlife and ensuring that Greenwood keeps the allure of its scenic nature. Greenwood is a wonderful example of how a cemetery serves its community, and if you weren't interested in touring cemeteries, I hope that this has inspired you. There might be some very interesting history buried there. So, thank you. And if we have any questions, we'll open it up at this time. We do have a microphone, so if you have a question, just wait for the microphone to come to you. That way our online audience can hear the question as well.
Hello. Hi. Is there any talk of future recognition of July Perry's gravesite? It just seems like, oh, by the way, instead of really important.
Yes. So she was asking if there are future plans to add a recognition for July Perry. And yes, when I talked with the manager over at Greenwood, we did say that there were going to be recognitions added for July Perry as well. Yes, and there is a recognition for him as well in front of our museum if you're interested in checking that out. Okay. Okay, so if you didn't hear in here, they asked about what made me interested in studying Greenwood, and it's because last year when we were picking our topics for what we were going to write about in the community paper, every month we have articles from different researchers here at the History Center submit articles to the community paper, and I have been on a walking tour at Greenwood, as I'm sure most of you have, and I found it to be very interesting, and so I just wanted to gather a little bit more information, and then once that door opened, once you start reading the old newspaper articles in the 1930s, you realize there's a lot of drama that happened around Greenwood, and I didn't realize, so as the time went on, I just kept finding more and more tidbits of drama that happened at Greenwood. And I was like, oh, wow, this is really, really interesting.
I have a question about the expansion of the cemetery. Do you know if the city has given any consideration to purchasing the homes on the east side of the cemetery so that they could expand it?
So if anyone in here didn't hear, they were asking if the city has given considerations to purchasing the land or the homes on the east side of the cemetery. I am not too sure about that. Danielle, do you have an idea? Danielle is the manager at Greenwood.
Hi, everybody. I don't know if this is on, if you can hear me, but thank you so much for coming, and great job. I really appreciate this being a topic. No, at this time, we respect the residents and the layout of the cemetery, so our focus is to preserve the look and feel of what's current and just make sure that it has that attachment to the community that it should have.
Awesome. Do we have any more questions? One more? So she asked when the next tour is, and when I was talking with Danielle, I think that they're leaning more in a different direction with the tours. I know that it's something that is in the works right now. There's no set date on when the tours will be happening, but they will resume. They will resume, just no set date yet. One more? Sorry. We'll get you, and then we'll come back over.
It looked like there was a slide that had some of the wooden gravestones. Do they still have some of those that survived that fire, or what are the status of those?
Yes, so he was asking if about the wooden gravestones, and those two are the two that are still visible today. Most have sunken below the earth.
I have a question actually about the Powell Cemetery.
Yes.
If during your research you learned any more about the Powell Cemetery, because I've been through there and it looks like the members of the Powell family indeed are buried there, but also others.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yes. So the Powell Cemetery, Actually, no, I thought I had some information here, but the only information that I was able to find is just that it is their cemetery, but I imagine that they might have had people that were close to them that would have been buried there, because a lot of the families that first moved to Orlando, the pioneers of Orlando, had a little bit more money, so they were able to afford maybe private cemeteries. But that is all the information that I was able to find in my research. But thank you. Okay.
Was there anything that prompted them in changing the name to Greenwood?
I think, Danielle, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that it was just because the city had acquired the Orlando Cemetery, and so since that was the name of that the 8 original founders of Greenwood had, I'm not sure if the city wanted to change the name for that reason.
The only thing we've been able to find is the combination of the change of ownership as well as the look and feel of how they wanted to induce that feel of it. But nothing concrete. The information we have on that is mostly anecdotal.
Okay. And was there another question online? Oh, okay. Yes.
That picture where they showed the flooded property.
Yes.
Is that where the lake sat down?
So that was from the sinkhole that is right next. Yeah. So if you've been to the Greenwood urban wetlands, you know how they have a couple different smaller bodies of water. It does get flooded. I know that they added some engineering to make it not as flooded, but I do remember last year during the hurricane, I think it was Hurricane Irma, it did get pretty flooded over there. So I can't even imagine the flooding that happened during rainy seasons before the wells that they added.
I got here a little late. Did you talk about the Oak Ridge Cemetery?
Is that the one that is in Lakeland?
No, it's on Sand Lake Road.
Oh, I did not talk about that one. No.
It's got a lot of Pine Castle pioneers in there.
Oh, I'll have to look into that. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Check it out. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, one more question back here.
Since your scope of your research seemed to go even beyond Greenwood, have you heard of anywhere, either at Greenwood or in any other cemetery, where there are any plans in the Central Florida area to have green burials? Because right now you're required to either be cremated or put in a casket, and I didn't know if there's anything closer than Bushnell or Gainesville.
That did not come up in my research. Danielle, do you have a comment on that or?
So don't quote me, but I think that it's a Florida statute type of restriction, not so much cemetery specific. We have heard of other states who are offering it, and then we have heard of other cemeteries who try to get around it by, incorporating different types of caskets that give more of access to the ground so that it feels like green burial. But I think that's a Florida statute type of restriction.
Okay, and for the people online that weren't able to hear that, Danielle said that it's a Florida statute, or that green burials might not be bigger here in Florida, especially I think because since Greenwood's owned by the city, they have more regulations as well.
We do have regulations. We, for the most part, follow Florida statute.
Yeah.
So I truly believe that statewide, it is a statute that they expect people to do some kind of capacity, but don't quote me.
Okay. Perfect. Do we have any more questions? No? Okay. Well, thank you for joining us and